will play host to a crucial meeting on the goods and services tax tomorrow. State finance ministers will get into a huddle to give finishing touches, but the model GST law does have many loose ends. Joining us now to discuss the key concerns that dog the GST is VK Garg, former Joint Secretary at North Block. Mr. Garg, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV 18. Sir, given what we are seeing now, from the government, from the Congress party, the fact that we have the empowered panel on the GST meeting here in the capital tomorrow, how hopeful are you that the GST is likely to go through in this session of Parliament?
I think for the first time in many years, one is getting very, very positive signals from practically all the parties. The issues, I think, are now moving away from some kind of political to now really the design of the GST, whether there is something that we need to do before we really usher the GST on a countrywide basis, something that needs to be further done in the constitution bill or not. So these are just a very few issues, and I think one is very hopeful now.
Okay, so hope is in the air, but as you rightly pointed out, now it boils down to the design and the architecture of the GST itself. Let me ask you about the model GST law then, Mr. Garg, because there seems to be a lack of clarity on several issues now. What are the key clarifications that you would like to see from the government when it comes to the model GST law?
Model law, I think there's much of a work to be done. They have, the only good thing is that they have placed something in public domain, and now which is for people to comment. And one can go through provision after provision. I think there are a lot of issues, so one gets an impression that over the month or two, based on the feedback from the industry, all these issues will be taken up. The key issue itself of the supply itself, what is liable to tax, I think people have serious issues because nowhere in the world GST is levied on transactions without consideration. And that can lead to all kind of things, unimaginable things into the GST net. One doesn't really know how that will fan out. There are issues relating to dual control, because something like 80–85% of the assessees in the service sector net will be below the what they call the composition levy threshold. So whether they should be subjected to dual control and so on and so forth, and that's a very big issue. There are issues relating to time of supply, because in the model law, India has chosen something which is not there, to my knowledge, to any part of the world, and that needs to be touched up. Valuation provision needs a bit of a touch-up. Place of supply rules can lead to dual taxation, what you call double taxation in different regimes. So some bit of touching up is required here and there in all the issues. Then there are issues relating to sectors that have not been included in the GST. At the first glance, one gets a feeling that these are all status quo, like whether it's alcohol or petroleum or power. At the first level is that if they're out, we are not touching them. But that's not the situation. You have now a strange cocktail of GST inputs and non-GST outputs, and vice versa, non-GST inputs and GST outputs. So one has to really think through how these very critical sectors of the economy will be impacted. This can also impact ports, airports, and canals, dams, irrigation projects, because real estate is technically out, while the services from these sectors are within the GST. So one has to see that the tax credits are passed on in the whole process. In the old system, let's say if you were sourcing naphtha for a power project, power is outside the GST, naphtha is inside the GST. One could source it, let's say, against a C-form. Now, whether a C-form is not supposed to apply to a GST supply. Or take a vice versa case, you could source natural gas for a fertilizer plant. Natural gas could be sourced at 2% against CST. But whereas fertilizer will now be into the GST, naphtha is not going to be, natural gas is not going to be into the GST. So one has to see how this whole thing will fan out. Otherwise, it will lead to exorbitant costs for these critical sections of the industry. And the entire law can't be built into a model law, because some of the things are in, some of the things are out. Similarly, there could be GST inputs which go into a non-GST exports. So one gets worried on that, how exactly the zero rating of the exports will be done. So I think that clarity.
Mr. Garg, let me interrupt you because that is a long list of issues that you raised there, sir, and it makes one wonder how successful the rollout will be if the GST bill does in fact go through in its current avatar in Parliament. But one of the key problems, as you just mentioned, there is the long list of exclusions and the cascading impact on account of that. Do you think that these can be ironed out given where we stand today?
See, all these issues can be thought through and addressed. Only thing that I'm raising is that they don't seem to have been addressed, at least at this stage. Clarity is not emerging how they are going to be looked at. And there are commitments that have been given in various contractual obligations government has taken. And for example, in the exploration sector, government has said that the burden of taxes will be neutralized. But that was relating to the central taxes, which means custom duties and central excise and so on and so forth. That nomenclature is going to vanish. So central excise will get subsumed into GST. So what happens to the SGST portion of that? So I think that's coming out finally as a very complex kind of a thing. And you need to build consensus with the state in all these things that are, fanning out of that. And one only hopes that finally the prices of these products, which impact critical sections of practically every part of the industry. Now, if you take, for example, power could be a huge cost in certain sectors like steel, for example, coal, mining, chemicals, cement. And if one is really hoping that the GDP goes up, one has to ensure that the cascading in these critical sectors, because of energy and particularly power, is somehow taken care of.
You're raising valid concerns there, Mr. Garg, on the cascading impact. But let me also ask you about the revenue neutral rate and the recommendations that have been made by the Arvind Subramanian panel. Do you believe that because of the long list of exclusions, we are likely to see more pressure build up on that revenue neutral rate as has been proposed by the Subramanian panel?
See, first thing is he has said RNR, not exactly an RNR. RNR he has recommended is 15% or so. RNR, this is the standard rate that he has recommended of 18%. I have gone through his report. Some of the things that probably needed to be looked at is the amount of cascading which is already in the system. Most states, practically all states, are denying tax credits of 4% on stock transfers. There are states like Gujarat which deny tax credit even when there is a CST sale. And there are lots of credits which are not being given in the existing systems. I didn't find a mention of these in his report. So there is a huge cascading which is already existent in the system. And that, when is removed, and that's the very purpose of GST, I think there'll be a pressure on the suggested RNR to that extent. And one has to also see if one is really not, because 80% of the industry is small-scale sector. And what is the threshold finally for the composition scheme? A very high threshold means again RNR would be under pressure, and a very low threshold means the small industry would have huge compliance burden. So all these issues have to be optimized in a very mature manner.
Well, let's see whether we finally do see the GST being taken up this week or in this session. But Mr. Garg, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV 18 and taking us through the issues that require clarification from the government to ensure the successful rollout of the goods and services tax. Dear FM, we hope you're listening.